Welcome back, everybody. I hope you're all excellent. In this video, I want to talk about the hot topic word of the day, beginning with L. It's not loser, it's latency. What it is, what it isn't, why it's important, and why you probably shouldn't worry about it too much if you're a guitar player who plays through digital effects or a modeling system. So let's get started by actually defining what latency is. Latency is simply the time it takes for audio to enter a system and exit a system. So it's simply a time delay or a time shift. For example, if you're playing through, an Axe-Fx, your guitar signal has to go to the front end of the Axe-Fx. It has to be converted from an analog signal to a digital signal via digital sampling, then gets processed, and then the reverse happens. It gets converted back to an analog signal, and it goes out of some speakers. Fair enough. If you're using, a Universal Audio Apollo interface like I am right now, very similar thing is going to happen. It's going to be picking up my voice. It's going to sample that analog signal, convert it into a digital signal. It's going to be processed. It's going to be reconverted and spat out of some speakers at the end of the day. Now, another system like that is simply sound just coming through an amplifier and out of a speaker, whether it is a tube amplifier, which has no AD to DA conversion, or whether it's, an Axe-Fx running into a power amp through a speaker system. Because the speaker is a certain distance away from your ear, there is going to be a time delay between the sound coming out of the speaker and traveling to your ear and you actually perceiving it. So you playing and feeling like you're playing something on the guitar, because a guitar is a very tactile instrument. That feel is important. And the actual process signal arriving at your ears, there's going to be a delay in there. You might like to describe that as latency. And if you stand far enough away from your amp, you're definitely going to feel that. So that's all latency is, and it's apparent in just about any system.
No latency when you do this.
The other question is how we perceive latency. Okay, that's really, really important because everybody is going to perceive that slightly differently, but what are the limits of that perception? I think that's really, really important in there. Before we do that, though, we should talk about a couple of things that aren't latency, specifically related to digital modelers. When you change a preset on a digital modeler and you have a slight gap when it changes everything, that's not latency. And I've heard people refer to that as latency, like, I have a latency in switching presets on my digital modeler, or I have a latency when I turn my system on. That is not latency. If you're calling that latency, you probably shouldn't, because it's an inappropriate term there. The definition does not match your description there. Call it a switching lag or something like that. Lag's another L word, so I can see why people get it confused with latency in there. But that's not what latency is. The other thing is, whether you're standing 20 meters away from your Marshall stack, or whether you're running a whole bunch of plugins or a whole bunch of different digital processors, each with a little bit of latency, and that latency is adding up, the human ear can't tell what the source of latency is. When you hear a time delay in something, your ear doesn't go, ooh, that's a time delay because of analog to digital conversion and back. It doesn't do that. So the source of latency doesn't matter. It's just time delay. That's it. It doesn't matter if it's coming from an analog signal or a digital signal or a system. It's just there. It's the time delay. Your ear cannot tell what the source is. That's another really important thing. The other thing is latency doesn't impact the quality of, say, a guitar sound or anything. Again, it's just a time shift. It's just a time shift. It doesn't actually impact the quality of the tone or anything like that. It certainly affects the feel of playing guitar. If you've got a system with a lot of latency in there, that's not necessarily a good thing, right? Because you're going to be hitting the string and then you have this weird time delay and it just doesn't feel right. And that is a really, really valid concern. The tactile feel you have when you play your instrument is really, really important. So I want to do one thing. I am going to take this preset I've got at the moment with my guitar, and I am just going to play it. What you're going to hear is the sound of this microphone, which isn't pointed at speakers, coming through studio monitors. So basically, it's going to sound like garbage. It sounds like this. No detectable latency in there. To me, that just feels good. That's my happy place. That's all that really matters when you're playing through something like this. Does it feel good? So what I'm going to do here is I am going to add 105 milliseconds of delay. No feedback, mix at 100%. This is what it sounds like. Because that's just a time delay, and because latency is just time delay, I've added 105 milliseconds of latency to this system, and it's way, way, way too much in there. What I can do, though, is if I click on the time right here, I can decrease this in 10 millisecond increments, and I can find the point where the perceived latency is okay for me. So I'm going to do that right now. Okay, this is pretty good. Where am I? 15 milliseconds. That's pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. So introducing an extra 15 milliseconds into the system, I honestly cannot feel the difference between that and not having that block in there. So going from that to 14 milliseconds, I'm just going to try that just out of curiosity. So we have 15 milliseconds. It's not changing the tone. It's not changing the feel. I can't perceive that 1 millisecond difference in there. If you're playing this rig, that's not to say that you might perceive that 15 milliseconds is too much latency or that 14 milliseconds is too much latency. But your ears don't tell you, oh, there's an extra millisecond of latency in there, dude. That's not how human perception works. There's kind of a threshold in there. And for me, it was probably that 15 millisecond point there where it's like, yeah, this is perfectly acceptable. It feels fine. It feels like I'm playing guitar. So there's this kind of threshold zone in there where you cross over, where 1 millisecond probably isn't going to be the difference, but 10 milliseconds might be the difference in there. Out of curiosity, I've got this set at 14 milliseconds at the moment, and what would that be in terms of distance from a speaker? People generally use the 1 millisecond to 1 foot rule, so that would be like 14 feet away from a speaker. I'm about 6'1", so if I was standing on stage and I had a floor monitor pointing up at me, or I was standing 6 feet away from my amp, they would give me the same amount of latency. And I mean, I've never felt latency in a situation like that. And according to this little experiment here, I couldn't tell the difference between 14 or 15 milliseconds of latency. So 6 milliseconds probably won't bother me. And if you're playing something like an Axe Effects, there's generally about 2 to 3 milliseconds of latency in there. So that's like being 2 feet away from your speaker. You're probably not going to detect latency in that system. Even if you're an alien with, incredible reflexes, that's just the way sound works. And you probably can't tell the difference between 2 and 3 milliseconds of latency, just between that, what I'm talking about, that tactile feel in there, chugging on the low strings, which is always my test of whether I get on with a rig or not, and perceived latency in there. However, what if you had 4 digital pedals, each with about 4 to 5 milliseconds of latency in there? Then you might cross that threshold zone in there where it actually becomes detectable. What's really cool about, some high-end digital pedals that are out at the moment is a lot of them have an analog dry path, so your main signal won't be affected. But for something that doesn't have an analog dry path, those little bits of latency, if you're using a lot of pedals, that is going to add up. Also, think about an example like this. This is pretty interesting, feedback from a system. If you think of someone like, Gary Moore famously used to mark the spot on the stage at soundcheck where he got that infinite sustain when he was playing Parisian Walkways, or Robert Fripp when he was recording guitar for David Bowie's Hero song. The story goes that he put tape all around the studio, which were like those sweet spots to get feedback through his guitar. Funnily enough, Robert Fripp is a guy who uses an Axe Effects, and he's kind of infamous for being incredibly discerning with this stuff. What latency in a system would do is it would change where those spots are where you're getting feedback, because there is a time delay in there. So that's one important point where you would need to factor in small amounts of latency because it might be 1 or 2 feet either side or something like that, which is pretty easy to compensate for unless you're playing in a cardboard box. As I said earlier, if you're running a lot of digital devices through their, analog outs back in, then that can become problematic. But that's also why a lot of high-end studio gear has digital ins and outs. So you skip those stages of conversion and you skip all the extra latency. So that's kind of cool. The other thing with latency, especially in something like a workstation environment or something like that, is often when you're trying to have processing power in there and low latency, that's where you can run out of headroom. So a lot of the time, if you're working in a DAW or something like that, increasing the buffer size and increasing the latency for a given sample rate is going to give you more headroom. But for something like an Axe FX, or if you're using any other digital modeler or effects unit out there, and it's just a simple in-out scenario, the latency is so low that it is going to fall below human perception. Even though there's some people out there who claim they can feel latency of like a millisecond, which I'm highly skeptical of. But, that again comes down to individual perception. I also don't want to discredit people's perception there. But maybe in a case like that, it's not actual latency that they're experiencing. Maybe latency is just the word they've grasped for in a situation like that. Because I couldn't tell the difference between, no latency and 15 milliseconds. I'm definitely not going to be able to detect 2 or 3 milliseconds. I'm definitely not going to be able to detect the difference between 2 or 3 milliseconds in there. So if you're uncomfortable with digital modeling, which is a perfectly fine situation to be in, even if you're using, say, a digital modeler in the effects loop of your tube head, which, by the way, is going to have pretty much the same amount of latency as just using a modeler. So that's kind of a moot point. If you're someone who's like, no, but I want the real feel of an amp, but I want digital effects, you're still going to have latency in that system no matter what. If you're uncomfortable with digital modeling, that's fine. Just say you're uncomfortable with it. Just be honest. It's a totally okay position to have. I'm uncomfortable around dogs, for no reason. I just like cats better. I just, spent my whole life around cats. When I see a dog, I'm like, a dog. You cool, man? Yep, I'm cool. You want to come over here and slobber on me? Well, okay. You seem like a friendly dog, but I'm not going to be super happy about this. I get that people are like that when it comes to an Axe FX. They prefer tube amps. That's awesome. But if that's why you're uncomfortable about it, just be honest about it. It's not because of latency. That's the whole point. You can't detect that latency. You're just tricking yourself. It's just bias. And, we all have our little biases, and that's totally fine. That's human nature, but it's not latency. It's not that technical definition of latency. So I've just spent like 13 minutes harping on about all of this stuff. Hopefully it was in some way informative. What do you guys think? I'm always looking for feedback in this kind of situation. I was talking about feedback earlier. And I'm not discounting latency. Obviously there are several situations where having too much latency is a real problem. But the specific case of a digital modeler, which has about 2 to 3 milliseconds of latency, the not so great ones have about 5 milliseconds of latency. If you're not vibing with it and you think it's latency, then it's just because you're not vibing with it. It's actually not because of latency. So yeah, there's my hot take for the week, guys. As always, stay excellent, be good to one another. I will see you next time. I guess the important thing is, whether you prefer cats or dogs, they do just love to sit on your stuff and put hair everywhere. Case in point. How you going there? The cats are pretty good most of the time.